Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome my dear friend, Professor Alexander Dvorkin. And we're going to be talking about a wide variety of subjects here. So, hi, Alexander.
Yes. Hi, everybody.
And if you'd like now to put your record on, then you can introduce us to your audience.
Hi, dear John. Дорогие друзья, позвольте мне представить вам моего дорогого друга Джона Эйтека. И мы сейчас с ним поговорим об очень важных вещах. Dear John, so first of all, could you tell a little bit about yourself and how sort of you got involved with all this stuff with undue persuasion, unethical persuasion, mind control, or whatever the terms being used, brainwashing, whatever, and how in the world you started with that, and then what do you do now in order to prevent people to get involved with these things, and especially sort of young people, because mostly we'll be talking to the teachers and the social teachers and psychologists from high schools. So there is a problem, and of course, so in this talk, at least, well, preventing of young people getting into cult and other types of unethical groups is our first priority.
Yeah, it's my first priority too. My concern is absolutely the prevention, the idea that if you can teach people at a young age how to spot predatory people and the techniques that they use, then there's less chance that people will be seduced or recruited into authoritarian groups, cult groups, whatever we call them. It is for me, after I've been doing this for a long time, and you have too, the rules are fairly simple, and what there is to learn is not that complicated. My own story began when I was 19. I'd had a bad breakup in a relationship. My girlfriend had run off with one of my best friends, and I was very upset about it. I was 19. I mean, what are you going to do?
When you're 19, yeah, it's terrible.
It is. And my pride was very wounded. What can I say? And I looked for help. I talked to my doctor. I talked to a friend who was a psychiatrist. I phoned up a minister of the Anglican Church, and none of them gave me any real help. I talked with all of them about this thing. I'd read this book by this guy, Ron Hubbard, called Science of Survival. And I was quite impressed by what it said. It was offering a straightforward therapy that would help you overcome emotional difficulties. There was none of the weird science fiction that Scientology is so well known for. And the psychiatrist friend said she didn't know anything about it. The Anglican priest said he knew nothing about it, which was incredible because only 3 years before there'd been a major government report about them, and they didn't even bother to go and check. So it all sounded...
Sorry, I'll introduce you, but just to make things straight, I'll tell to our listeners that Ron Hubbard is a founder and first dictator of international destructive cult called Scientology. Yeah. One of the most destructive cults there is, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it certainly is more destructive towards its critics than any other supposedly religious group, pseudo-religious group. And in the time that I've dealt with it, which is it's 37 years since I left, so it's been a long time, all over the world, when I talk to people, they say that it's the most invasive of all of the groups, that people don't normally recover without help from, their minds being reconstructed by Scientology. So I walked in, I got involved. I spent 9 years. I was never a live-in member. Most people will end up working for them. So I was never humiliated or abused during my 9 years, which is quite unusual.
If I also may introduce, because it might be sort of new for many of our listeners, but in Scientology, just to put it very simple, in Scientology, every step costs you money. Whatever you do, whatever you sign for, you have to pay, you have to pay, you have to pay. It's like a ladder with hundreds and hundreds of steps, and for each next step you pay money. So when you run out of money, and most people run out fairly soon, then the cult, there are two opportunities. It's either they tell you that, well, sorry, that's it, find some more money, or of course you can borrow and stuff, and they'll make sure that they get everything out of you, whatever they can. So, but when you have more money, come back. Or they might offer you to take a job at Scientology. And they'll tell you, of course, we'll pay very little and the working days unlimited, but it's a wonderful adventure. And anyway, if you work for us, you'll be able to get some courses for free.
Yeah.
So that's how people get into it.
Yeah, and to give some idea, at the moment, to do all of the steps of Scientology would cost you more than $250,000.
At the very least.
Yeah.
Because Scientologists have a fantastic ability of making you pay for the same thing twice, sometimes, whatever. They know how to do it.
Yeah, I talked with Lillian Collins, who was the wife of the head of Collins Publishers, who at the time were the biggest publisher in the world. And she wondered, this is a long time ago, she wondered how it was that Scientology had always cost her so much more money than it cost anybody else. And she'd spent more than £1 million at that time. And this is, nearly 40 years ago. So if you have money, they'll have it from you. I've met many people who are bankrupted, who borrowed way beyond their means to pay back, people who gave inheritances away, who sold their houses and gave the money to Scientology. Then at the other end, as you say, there are people who will join the staff of Scientology and work for them. At worst, that will be what's called the Sea organization, and that's sea as in a body of water. And this is named after, Hubbard took some ships into the Mediterranean in the 1960s and called this thing the Sea Organization. They will quite typically work a 90-hour week for perhaps $5 or $10 in pay. They're no longer permitted to have children. They're sent to away to outer organizations if they have children. Many women have been forced to have terminations, in fact. So it's become abortions. It's become very brutal. I led a charmed life. I joined in 1974. I left in 1983, and I'm sorry.
That's 9 years.
Yeah, and just a couple of months short of 9 years. And I did most of what was available. The idea is that you are meant to achieve these abilities where you'll be, you'll have perfect intelligence, complete recall, not only of this lifetime, but of your many past lifetimes, because they believe in reincarnation. You'll have superpowers. You'll be able to leave your body and go to other planets. You'll be able to read people's minds. You'll be, whatever you want to do, you'll be able to do. This is complete nonsense. I did 25 of the 27 levels that were available, and I never met anybody who had the slightest supernatural ability. In fact, when I used to give talks for many years, I'd put a little bit of tin foil, a little bit of aluminium foil on the table in front of me, and I'd say, if there are any Scientologies operating thetans here, I'd just like them to move this bit of tin foil 1 centimeter on the table. And as yet, nobody's ever managed to do it. So,
yeah, just clearing the term, operating thetan in Scientological language is sort of being like God, who can move out of your body, travel around the space, come back to your body whenever you wish, just throw around planets just with the power of your thought, and do all other wonderful things. But in fact, as you said, none of them even was able to move a little piece of aluminum foil.
No, and the reality is that you and I would not be able to be having this conversation if they had these superpowers, because they would have managed to stop us by now. And we've been talking about it for quite a few years now. When I left, a lot of people came to me because I was very analytical about what had happened, and I started to work out, who Hubbard was and what he'd done. And hundreds of people from all over the world contacted me in various stages of distress, and they wanted help. So through the 1980s, I researched a history of Scientology, which is still the only history of the group, really, which is called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. I worked, that book was used by the professional journalist Russell Miller, who's a quite famous biographer. He wrote a biography of Hubbard called Barefaced Messiah. And
I should say that your book, The Piece of Blue Sky, or the later version, Let's Tell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, is the book on Scientology.
Oh, thank you.
It's really kind of the most researched, the most authoritative, and the most clever book about Scientology. And it's also a very good reading.
Thank you.
Yeah, it reads like a novel, really. It's a page turner.
I think the story itself is so incredible. I think that we will see in the next 10 years a whole genre of films that's just about Scientology and Ron Hubbard. It's like, cowboy films or science fiction, because Hubbard's life was such an incredible confidence trick from beginning to end. So, I got very deeply involved. We interviewed Hubbard's aunt, Margaret Roberts. We interviewed somebody who'd been to school with him. We interviewed, I interviewed about 100, 150 people, along with Russell Miller. And so we became very familiar with the subject. I read tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of pages of Hubbard's transcripts of his lectures and statements he'd made. And very soon, go ahead.
That's a Nobel Prize feat. To Hubbard, and survive. I wouldn't do it for, like, I don't know, for anything, because it's awful. Hubbard stuff just kills me. It's so boring, so very boring, and so poorly written. He's a writer, for God's sake, but he writes awfully. Really.
Yeah.
His language is so I don't know, unpoetic, on anything. It's just I was told he was a very good storyteller. I can't believe it, but he had a fantasy. Really, his fantasy worked well, but put it in writing. His writing is awful. Well, anyway, sorry for all this lyrical introductions.
No, that's fine. He was he just about made a living as a writer, writing what's called pulp fiction, dime, penny a word fiction. He wrote under names like Lee Remington Colt and Legionnaire number something or other. He just poured out this stuff in these cheap magazines, and he never really made that much money at it. He would later boast that he'd become a millionaire through it. He was absolutely living in poverty.
Yeah, he was a loser.
And occasionally it's worth saying that Stephen King, the novelist, has said that the story Fear by Ron Hubbard is his favorite story. So sometimes he came up with an interesting story, but as you say, his writing style is really strange. It's as if he's not really living in the present moment. So he'll pull out words from the 17th century and put them into a prose that belongs in the 1940s. And it's very clumsy. It's also worth saying that in Scientology, he generated 2 dictionaries, which amount to almost 1,200 pages of new words, neologisms that he'd created. And that, so to understand Scientology, the reason that there are no academics there will never be an academic who deeply studies Scientology unless they've been involved in it, because you can't maintain the interest. It, as you say, it just becomes so tedious going through his voluminous writings.
But one thing sort of we can tell right away, you know, with this dictionary of all these words, if we remember George Orwell, the one who controls the language controls the mind.
Yes.
And he definitely created a new language, and the one who, and we'll talk about it today, I suppose. But the one who created this language, and when once you start thinking in these Scientological terms, then your mind starts working in Scientological patterns, and then you're caught.
Yeah, I mean, the specific reference by George Orwell is the appendix to the book 1984. I get into trouble because I don't particularly like 1984. I think it's badly written compared with George Orwell's other works, and that's because he only made one draft of it because he died. It was the last book he wrote. But the appendix at the end, I think everybody should read. It's just 10 or 20 pages where he explains how language can be pruned so that you can't think against the state. There are no words left anymore to have a thought crime, as he calls it. And he talks about doublespeak, where, for example, instead of having a ministry of propaganda, you have a ministry of truth. Instead of having a ministry of war, you have a ministry of defense. You know, so you reverse the meanings of words.
And in Orwell, it's actually the Ministry of Peace, which is next step.
Yes, absolutely.
War, defense, and then Ministry of Peace.
You're quite right. In this country, after Orwell was published, the Ministry of War became the Ministry of Defense. But you're right, he has a mini peace and mini truth. But yes, Hubbard, I think it's true always that our thinking is confined by language, by the words we know and the meanings we give to them. And so it's always a good idea to have a big vocabulary, to think broadly, and to realize that a word used in one place, in one discipline, might mean something else somewhere else. When I looked at the social sciences, I was fascinated to find that social psychology and sociology have a whole different language. They don't share languages because they're at war with each other. You know, it's crazy. So anyway, I put together a history. I began, you know, I talked with hundreds of members who had problems. I myself, fairly quickly, within a few months of leaving, I left because I thought Hubbard was gone. I left because I thought Scientology was a good thing. And I was at the center of an independent Scientology movement in the United Kingdom for about 6 months or so. But gradually I lost faith. I found material about Hubbard, particularly contradictions, things that he'd said. So in one place, he says he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II in a document called My Philosophy of 1965. But in 1957, in a lecture, he talks about going down to Hollywood on the 25th of July, 1945, and beating up 3 sailors. So, you know, the war ends on the 14th of August, and he's crippled and blinded in one story, and he's able to beat 3 able-bodied sailors up in another story. There's another in December 1950 in an interview with Look magazine where he says his war wounds consisted of having fallen down a ship's ladder, having pink eye or conjunctivitis, having ulcers, and something wrong with his feet. There are no war wounds. There's no being crippled or blinded anymore. So I, over the years, built up such a collection of these contradictions, and it became evident that Hubbard, firstly, was not giving what he promised, that nobody was being cleared, as he put it. Nobody was achieving a perfect human state. Nobody was achieving supernatural abilities. They were just being tricked into this Byzantine fantasy world, you know, this labyrinth of deception where there was only the language. People didn't have these abilities. Worse than that, he created an intelligence agency, and his wife and 10 other Scientologists were sent to prison in the United States for crimes that included false imprisonment, kidnapping, burglary, breaking and entering, and stealing tens of thousands of government documents, having forged government credentials. They did similar things in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in France.
Rhodesia and
South Africa, Australia, and wherever they went, there were allegations in Greece, in Italy, and Spain. Wherever you go, this intelligence agency, which used to be called the Guardian's Office and is now called the Office of Special Affairs. And I did an interview on my channel with Mike Rinder, who was the head of the Office of Special Affairs for almost 20 years.
And was a chief enforcer of Scientology.
Yeah, and his job was to silence critics, as he explains. He met me in 1994, 1995. He came to the village where I live, and he said that although I seemed like a nice and reasonable person, he knew that I had to be destroyed because I was an opponent of Scientology, and that meant that I was against all that is good in humanity. So even though I seemed like a nice fellow, he knew he had to destroy me, and that was the mentality within that branch. I must say, and it's important to say, I knew nothing about, in the 9 years I was involved, I knew nothing about the intelligence agency and what it was doing. It was a deep secret, but a lot of money was being spent on silencing critics, stopping free speech, and preventing any initiative to investigate Scientology. It didn't work very well for them.
Yeah, blackmail and like following people, threatening them, scaring them, attempting on their lives, etc. So all those things were done.
Yeah, I mean, in the court record, it shows in the Breckenridge trial in 1984 that Gerald Armstrong, after he left Scientology, there was an attempt to kill him. I talked with a woman who worked in the intelligence agency, which used to be called Branch 1 of the Guardian's Office, and she told me that she'd had sex with 2 members of Parliament to get information from them. A woman I knew very well had spent 4 years working as a volunteer with another member of Parliament, Clement Freud, because he wanted to bring about freedom of information. And so she was ferrying material. In Germany, Scientologists are not allowed to join the civil service because of this record of infiltration and espionage that they have. So, I discovered that I'd been involved in something very dark and very unpleasant. And I think my main drive was that sense that I contributed to this thing and I ought to do something about it now, even though I hadn't known the harm it was doing. I hadn't really intended to spend quite so long doing something about it. But
now it's kind of your whole life project.
Well, it moved from Scientology. In 1996, having been sued in the United States and in this country, and having lost cases which never went to court. They were all lost on technicalities before getting to court. And
Scientology knows how to do it, and they have all the means, all the money, and all the means to silence their critics, even like on a pre-court level. Fortunately, in Russia, they cannot do as much as they do in other countries, even in the courts, because our courts work differently. And thanks God for that. But otherwise, I know how difficult it is to even critique Scientology in other countries. Even like Time magazine, which published a series of articles about Scientology. Scientology sued Time magazine, and it's a very rich magazine. And if I remember correctly, the whole process took like nearly 10 years.
It took 20 years.
20 years.
From 1991 to 2011. It cost Time magazine $2 million to defend themselves. It was over a single article called Scientology, the Cult of Greed by Richard Behar.
Greed and power.
Yeah.
Greed and power. Yeah, eventually they won the court case, but they lost so much money and time and everything, so they figured it's not worth it.
And it's reckoned that Scientology spent $20 million on that case. There's a point I was told where they hired 15 law firms full-time to work for them. They also hire private detectives to harass people. Whenever I went to the United States, I'd be followed by men with guns, which was a little bit scary. There was a whole campaign. They traveled, a guy called Eugene Ingram, who was thrown out of the Los Angeles police. He traveled all around the world trying to find information about me. He even went to Australia to talk to the girlfriend who'd run away from me when I was 19. And they published scurrilous lies. They accused me of being a rapist, an attempted murderer, a child molester, a heroin addict, a drug dealer, all sorts of things. And they will still put these ideas forward. They seek to blacken the reputation of critics.
Yeah, well, they write many things about me too. And this Ingram had contacted me once by mail. Fortunately, I have no whatever sort of desire to meet the guy in person.
No,
he didn't travel to Russia.
Yeah, exactly. And they pay out millions of dollars. I was told by the former head of their harassment division in the United Kingdom that she knew of that £2 million had been spent on trying to silence me. So eventually, beginning of '96, I decided I just didn't want to do this anymore. That it was not a good way to live. I'd worked on about 150 court cases. I worked on about 200 media pieces. I believe I'm the only person in the world who's been appointed as an expert witness on Scientology by the courts, by the High Court in London, during the Russell Miller case in 1987. But it was just, there was no way of surviving what was happening. So I moved my interest and I started to research terrorism. And, this is before 9/11. I started to look at the Baader-Meinhof group, at the PLO, at Sendero Luminoso, the Tamil Tigers, the PKK, whatever. Because I saw that the same fanatical beliefs drive people, whether the group is a pseudo-religious cult or a commercial cult. We have multi-level marketing groups.
So it's a good thing you mentioned them, because I'm sure there are these groups in Tatarstan, and many people never think of them as cults, but in fact they are. And then of course, another type of psycho cult. In other words, all those trainings and seminars of raising spiritual awareness, or how to become a leader, or how to attract the hearts of people of opposite sex, or whatever. So all those things are in fact also operated as cults. Well, we'll talk about it, and they're you started, but let's finish your story. So you started studying terrorism, and then.
Yeah, and I wrote several novels trying to explore, the mindset of somebody as they become involved in a fanatical or authoritarian group. And
there are it calls for explanation of the term, because what do you mean by authoritarian group, and what's the difference? You can say a cult, you can say destructive cult, or you can say totalitarian cult. That's what we say in Russia. Incidentally, it's me who first used this term, totalitarная секта, in Russian. I never thought that I'm using a new term in Russian. I thought it was so obvious, but it turned out that I was the first who used it. The idea was to distinguish it from some quite normal sects, so to say, that might be break off from large religious movement and with some strange beliefs, but nonetheless the people are normal members of society. They're not recruited by deception. It's their own choice, and as long as it's their own choice, and then they can reason, they can argue, they can reason. They have logical abilities to think logically. So then it's normal. It's not a totalitarian cult. Well, but anyway, use the term authoritarian. So
yeah, I think that the discrimination that I make is when people become emotionally passionate to the extent that they cannot talk about their beliefs, then they have become a cult member. We should be able to listen to points of view that differ from our own. I mean, my go-to book would be John Stuart Mill on Liberty, written in the 1850s, an essay of about 100 pages, where he says, you know, even though you have heard this person explain things before, even though you believe that they're an idiot, you should still be willing to listen to them again, because you could be wrong. And I think where passion's aroused, and we saw this, you know, the extreme is the Nazis or Mussolini's fascists, that people become so passionate they're willing to kill others just because of what they believe in. So authoritarian, I too use the word totalitarian or totalist, which means the same thing. It's a modern word. It came about in the 20th century to mean total authoritarian. So totalitarian is what's called a portmanteau word. It's two words pushed together to say that these people are not simply authoritarian, they are total authoritarians. That is to say, they will completely take your life over. And that would be a true statement about somebody who is in the C organization in Scientology, for example. They do belong to a totalitarian group. However, my membership of Scientology wasn't like that. I read 3 books that criticized Scientology. Nobody told me I shouldn't. I talked about those things whenever I disagreed about something. So it would not have been proper to say that my relationship was totalitarian, but it would be proper to say that it was authoritarian. And by authoritarian, there are 2 forms of authoritarian. There are the people who believe that they should be in charge and tell everybody else what to do. I call them human predators, bullies. People like Donald Trump, for example, he's a very good example of an authoritarian. He's somebody who, when he sat down with the generals and listened to what they had to say, said, I know more about it than you do. When he listened to people in the intelligence community, he said, I know more about it than you do. I'm the person who should be in charge because I'm a very stable genius, to use his own words about himself. That's an authoritarian. But most authoritarians are actually people who follow such people. They believe that somebody else should have power and control over them because they're not capable of working things out for themselves.
Because freedom means responsibility.
Absolutely.
And many people fear responsibility. Could be like their own disposition, but it could be like a special moment of their life when they live through a crisis and they're afraid to act. And that's sort of the vulnerable point when they might meet this human predator. Or, well, actually, maybe you should explain what are these human predators? What are these antisocial people? What are these malignant narcissists? Whatever you call it.
Well, and I think it's important that you do list some of the many names that are used. The people with the narcissistic personality disorder, people who have the Machiavellian disorder. There are all sorts of psychiatric terms. My interest is not in diagnosing somebody as having a psychiatric condition. When I look at Donald Trump, you know, I could say, oh, well, he's a solipsist. He's somebody who doesn't think anything but him exists. Everything else is a part of his imagination. I could say he's a malignant narcissist. I could say he's an antisocial personality, a psychopath, a sociopath. But I'm not here to try and treat him. I'm not here to try and cure him. I'm here to say he's dangerous and people like him are dangerous. So yeah, I actually have in front of me a list of the characteristics of such people. The first thing is that they're mean. They're unpleasant towards other people. They do horrible things. And too often we justify that and allow that to happen. They're completely.
Then, sorry to introduce you, but again, for a lot of people, if you meet like a mean person, how in the world you would want to follow him? It's like I remember when I just started studying cults, and then at that point, I was registered with my mother's apartment. I lived elsewhere, but I was registered, and so when they looked up my whereabouts, they came up with my mother's number. So they started to call, and then my mother told me that this person called, and I said, well, he's from cult. So and she said, no, it cannot be so because he was talking so nicely. And I said, well, do you imagine? So they well, I'll kill you all and everything. No, these people can act nicely. So that's the question. You're right. These people are mean and unpleasant, but then somehow they're able to attract people.
They act in a charming way, and say that we were talking about a personal relationship that becomes abusive, and that a man will approach a woman and he'll tell her how lovely she is and how clever she is.
That's a very important point. So again, let's point out that just when we talk about cults, we imagine often people imagine some kind of separate organization. That's cults are elsewhere. It's those strange people that live there in the country with long white robes and with some like strange hats or something, and they act strangely. And of course, it's not. I'll never get into such thing. But the problem is that it's not only like cultic organizations, but there can be a cultic relationship. And cultic relationship can be found anywhere. Can be found in a proper cult, so to say. It can be found in a quite normal and benevolent religious organization where like a parish or a monastery can become a cult. It can be in a family, as you mentioned. It can be like doctor-patient relationship, it can be professor-students relationship, etc., etc., etc. So it doesn't have to be religious at all.
Underneath it, absolutely not. Underneath it is the control in the relationship. So with domestic violence, that the relationship will have been created where the partner who's being abused, and in this country, about 80% of abuse cases will be men abusing women, and about 20% will be women abusing men. So, that it happens both ways. I have a friend whose ribs were broken by his girlfriend as part of their relationship. So it can happen either way. It also, of course, can happen in gay relationships. It can happen in any relationship between people. But it tends to be a relationship where one is the parent and the other is the child, where one is in charge of the other. So an abused spouse, they're no longer allowed to see their friends. They're no longer allowed to spend time with their family. They have to follow all of these rules. But usually at the beginning of such a relationship, there'll have been a lot of flattery. There'll have been a charming way. And whenever the person threatens to leave, the abuser will apologize and say that they'll change their ways and they'll become good. You're dealing with a predator at that point. So the meanness is concealed during the process of seduction or recruitment. But what we'll see is, for example, you're in a restaurant with your charming new friend, and they're being really, doting upon you. They're telling you what a wonderful person you are. And then the waiter brings the wrong wine and they scream at the waiter, and then they come back to you and they're sweet and polite again. This is the mask of the predator. They're selfish. They don't care about other people. No matter what they say, they pretend friendship, but they don't really feel anything for other people. For whatever reason. I mean, and I'm not saying this can't be cured. It's not an idea to go out and round these people up and burn them at the stake or anything. There are ways of helping such people, but we need to be careful of them. They brag and boast a lot. They tend to think of themselves as being very important, and they'll make up terrible lies about themselves. In Donald Trump's case, he pretends to be a successful businessman, but his tax returns for the last 15 years show that he's made less money than a cleaner would normally make in terms of tax. Yet he's living this lifestyle. What a brilliant businessman. He started a casino in Atlantic City, and rather than putting one, in Reno or Las Vegas or somewhere, he started another one. So he's competing with himself. And then he started a third one. So he had 3 casinos all competing with each other, and they all went bankrupt. But he will brag about what a brilliant businessman he is. It's a lie. And when they're challenged, they'll blame somebody else. They'll say, "Oh, it was the guy running the casino who made the mistake, not me." They don't tend to feel anxiety or fear. They have a different response to that. This is, some of them do. Some of them do get very anxious. They take risks, but they'll push the people around them into taking risks. So they'll treat people very badly. Sun Myung Moon used to send his followers out to sell wilted flowers on the streets for 18 hours a day. It's how my friend Steve Hassan had a dreadful car accident because he was so tired because of all of the work. So they don't think anything about other people's health or safety. They tend to be impulsive. They want thrills. They want to have something interesting happen because they have a very high threshold for pleasure. It takes a lot to stimulate them. So they'll be dangerous. They tend to be bullies. They tend to have explosive tempers. I used to run an artist agency when I was in Scientology, and my then wife, hadn't sold anything for a week. And I'd employed this guy who'd been a very high-ranking Scientologist, and he screamed his head off at her from about 6 inches away, And I hesitated because he'd worked with Hubbard. He was a senior executive. And it took me, the next time I saw him 3 days later, I plucked up courage and I sat him down and said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, he started crying. And he said, "Because Hubbard did it to us." And that was the first time I'd heard that Hubbard did these things, which he called severe reality adjustments. So he'd started a subject, Dianetics, which was meant to overcome trauma, and here he was traumatizing people. And that's quite typical for predatory people. They like humiliating people. One of the worst stories I heard about Hubbard was that 2 people had annoyed him when he had his ships in the Mediterranean. And so he made them, with all of the crew watching, he made them push a peanut around the deck of the ship with their noses. And they'd got splinters in their faces, this terrible thing of humiliation. Predators hate it if anyone else is praised. I'm watching yet another documentary about Donald Trump at the moment, and one of the people who worked with him said he just can't stand it if anybody else is being, anybody else is said to be good at doing anything. He's the only one that's important.
And it's the same with the same with every cult leader, because there cannot be like 2 cult leaders. There is nobody who is near this leader, because if somebody comes anywhere within a distance of cult leader, it disappears. He or she disappears immediately, and because there's only one.
And it's interesting, they'll often have a close relationship with somebody who is a second in command for a while. The Heaven's Gate, the Bo Peep cult, it was after the leader died that the second in command took over. Hubbard would, every year there'd be somebody else who was, the favorite. David Mayo, for example, or Reg Sharp in the 60s. And he would talk in lectures about how wonderful this person was, and then they'd be termed a suppressive person, and you'd be ordered not to speak with them anymore.
It's the same with David Miscavige.
Yeah, that he really has taken all of the next level of management.
Is the head of Scientology after Hubbard, and he doesn't only scream; he beats up people.
Yes, he has physically attacked many people over the years. He's also forced people to lick the carpet. He's forced people to clean with toothbrushes to make it's this oppression and control, which is always hidden. It's hidden from the majority of the members of the group. You know, when I interviewed people about Hubbard, I was shocked by stories I heard because none of them had seeped out. You know, everybody thought he was this wonderful, benevolent man. He wasn't. He was a very destructive man. Predators see life as a competition and they want to win. They don't see it as a collaboration where we can all win. They want to win. And if that means destroying other people, then they'll do it. They weaken people with insults and with put downs. So they're always denigrating people and humiliating them. They're cunning. They're manipulative. They see their way around things. Psychologists talk about what they call cognitive empathy. And I'm not sure of the term. They're not the words I'd use. But the idea is that a psychopath is able to see what you feel and manipulate your feelings because they don't have feelings in the same way. So they'll get you to do what they want you to do. They lie very easily. They think nothing of breaking their promises. And that's a simple thing to watch in people, that if they keep promising you something and they keep failing to deliver, you are dealing with a predator. They'll boast about how they've hurt other people and the harm they've done. They don't feel remorse or guilt. Psychopaths were first identified in the 19th century as people without conscience. And the modern text by Hervey Cleckley is called Without Conscience. They will, they're lazy, they live off other people, they're parasitic, they won't contribute themselves. They control everything. Micro control is a real aspect of the predatory character, that they get other people to live by all sorts of petty rules, which are impossible to follow. You know, you can't do what they demand of you.
And therefore, you'd always be guilty.
Yes, you will always feel shamed and guilt-ridden because you're not living up to what is demanded of you. They boast about having tricked other people, and they boast about breaking the law. And put those characteristics together, and I can send you the list to be translated into Russian. And what you're looking at is a predator. What you're looking at is an authoritarian, and at its worst extreme, a totalitarian, somebody who will, their history gives us many examples. Mao Zedong, Joseph Jugashvili, Stalin. There have been Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. There are many of these people. And in fact, many of the, you're a historian, you're a real expert in this area, that when we look to the idea of kingship or monarchy, most monarchs are predators. The way that they behave towards other people as if they were gods on earth and other people had no rights is quite normal. As democracy has gradually started up, and I don't think we've got very far with it yet, the idea that everybody should be involved in decisions, there should be a consensus and agreement between people to do what is best for everyone. You know, the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, as an American president once put it. That idea is being very slow in developing. I think partly because in our educational system, we demand obedience rather than demanding thoughtfulness and, questioning. We want people to just accept that these are the rules. My friend Ira Chalev, his book is available in Russian, actually. But you'll have to look it up because I can't read the Cyrillic. I'm just not educated enough. But he's written a book called Intelligent Disobedience, where he explains that he came up with the term courageous followership about 25 years ago. Very good friend of mine, known him for a long time. And he was giving a talk one day, And a woman in the audience said, you know, I have an example of what you're talking about underneath my desk. And Ira looked at her and said, what are you talking about? And she brought out a guide dog. And she was training this guide dog, perhaps to look after a blind person. And these dogs have to be taught intelligent disobedience. If the person they're with is about to walk into something, they have to stop them. And she's, you know, he was, well, why don't we teach our children intelligent disobedience, so that rather than doing what they have, you know, what they're told to do, why don't we teach them from a very young age? And he has a video, which if you look up Blink, Think, Choice, Voice through Google, gives you this 3-minute video for 5-year-olds saying, you know, if somebody asks you to do something you don't want to do, blink while you think, make a choice about what to do, and then voice it and say, I don't think that's right. Or, you know, but teach from an early age that compliance with orders isn't the best way to get a democracy, you know.
Yeah, well, talking about the guide dogs, they are taught intelligent disobedience. The problem with guide dogs is that they don't live long.
Yes.
Too much responsibility for them, and their heart doesn't hold for a long time. Then, unfortunately, those wonderful creatures die very early.
Yeah.
As we're talking about like political matters, as you know, I don't share your enthusiasm about democracy. I don't think it works anyway better than other political systems, because it's the same, usually predators that come to power, and then there are many other things. There are some invisible groups of influence which we know nothing about, but which in fact rule. And even the elected president, or whatever good he might mean, might not be able to do it because he won't be allowed to. And then, but of course, being in politics. And raising in politics sort of very well prevents you from being like a really good and honest person, because well, we have a Russian saying, when you live with wolves, you have to howl like wolves.
Mm-hmm.
If it makes sense in English.
Yes, absolutely.
So in other words, you live with wolves, you become a wolf.
Isaiah Berlin said that freedom for wolves is death for sheep. On the other side of the wolf metaphor, I don't believe that our current supposed democracies are working. I don't believe that until people understand authoritarianism and are willing to become responsible, that democracy can work. At the moment, we have Duterte, Bolsonaro, Modi, Abe, Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson. You can go all around the world, and people who are appalling. Duterte and Bolsonaro are really good examples of this. They can get to power using the current system. So I don't believe in the current system of democracy, but unless we can, you know, using artificial intelligence, create some way of choosing only the best people to be in charge, democracy, as Churchill said, is a, you know, it's not a great system, but it's better than any other system. And, you know, looking at history, looking at Ivan the Awesome, as I think that's how it really, we call him Ivan the Terrible. And you wrote your dissertation on him, I believe, that these tyrannical leaders, there has to be some way of changing leadership. And for me, the best way is to change authoritarianism. There is a hypothesis that interests me. The philosopher Schopenhauer in the 1840s said that he thought that about 60% of people basically didn't think. That same number comes up in the work of Erich Fromm, whose work I admire greatly. He says these people have a pseudo self. They live to show off. They live to, keep up with the Joneses, as the Americans saying, to have a nice car, to have wonderful clothes, to, their life becomes trying to impress other people.
To be not worse, than the neighbors.
Yes, to, rather than having some, more humanitarian goal in their lives. When Stanley Milgram did his famous compliance experiments at Yale University in the early 1960s.
Tell about it. Please
okay.
Tell about it, because not all might be familiar with it.
Okay. Milgram was a Yale professor, and he was very concerned that so many people in Germany and in the states that Germany conquered during the Second World War had simply complied with the extermination of the Jews, the Romanis, communists, blacks, anybody who disagreed with their philosophy. And he wanted to understand how that had happened. So he first of all went to a number of psychiatrists and he said, if I put a shock machine and I put somebody the other side of it and I tell people to shock them, how many people do you think will, just when they're asked to give an electric shock to another person, how many people do you think will comply? The psychiatrist said, about 1%. What Milgram found, and he performed, I think, 17 variations on the experiment over the years, he was very diligent. What he found was that 100% of people complied. Everyone was willing to shock somebody else. But he also found, that about 60% of people were willing to up the level of the shock to a marker that said XXX, very dangerous. And the person being shocked wasn't being shocked, it was an actor. And he made all sorts of variants on it. But he found that basically, if you put somebody with a white coat in the room who said, no, it's not your responsibility, you're just part of an experiment, that people were willing to comply. And that about 60% of people were basically willing to risk causing permanent physical damage to a stranger. That 60%, we're told, that number has gone down a little bit since Milgram did the experiments nearly 60 years ago, that there is less compliance. One of the experiments that came from was the Solomon Asch experiment. And a psychologist called Muzaffar Sharif, who is an Iranian living in America, had challenged Asch and said that he believed that you could get people to comply with the most ridiculous things. And Asch, to disprove this, offered 3 lines of different lengths on a piece of paper. And he put somebody into a room where there were 7 or 8 people already who would say that 2 of the lines were the same length when they weren't. And what he found, to his horror, was that the majority of people would just agree with the group. They wouldn't be willing to say no. Now, again, compliance in that experiment has gone down over the years, which is a healthy sign. So my argument is that if we could tip the balance, if we could get to 60% of people who were not just doing what the peer group pressure said, then we would have a chance of democracy. So that, I'm not sure if your position would differ from that, but I agree that it's not working now.
Yeah. Anyway, but let's sort of return to our topic. I think it's also when you talk about human predators, it's important that there are 2 sides to relationship. There is a predator, and then there are victims. Yeah. And the problem with victims that often they admire the predator, and they whenever it's sort of like a Stockholm syndrome. Whenever he abuses them, they say, well, actually he means well. It's me who deserves it, who deserved it because I behaved badly, and so I should be careful next time, and everything. So, and that's a problem.
I mean, let's explain Stockholm syndrome. That there was a bank robbery in Stockholm in Sweden, and when the police came to try and get the hostages out, the hostages, both at the time and later, defended the bank robbers who'd taken them hostage. and that they were more afraid that the police would hurt them than, and one of them in fact got into a relationship after this with one of the men who went to prison. So that's Stockholm syndrome. You also have what's called learned helplessness, which was a psychologist called Martin Seligman in Philadelphia. And he was torturing dogs as part of his experiment, which I've always thought was a horrible thing to do, but they were put in harnesses and given shocks. One day they forgot to put the harnesses on, and the dogs didn't move. They didn't try and escape the shocks. And so the idea of learned helplessness came along, that if you've been abused, then you'll accept abuse. And these are very important principles to understand if we are ever to have a civilization that worthy of the name civilization. So yeah, and that is, again, that's the authoritarian, where you believe that you don't deserve a proper, decent relationship, then you've become prey to the predator. Now, Donald Trump famously, and I know I keep coming back to him, but he's lost the election, so I can now. He famously told the man Tony Schwartz, who wrote The Art of the Deal, his first book for him, that his father had taught him that there were only predators and prey. Now, I've seen a similar statement. There's a book called Pimpology by a man who basically was a pimp running prostitutes. And he said, in the world, there are pimps and there are hoes, there are whores. Those are the only two types of people. Now, I would say this is totally misguided and wrong. There are predators and there are prey, but we can also, if we become mature, decent human beings, we can become non-predators and non-prey. We can become people who won't be preyed upon, and we'll become people who defend people who are being preyed upon, which I think is largely what you and I have spent the last several decades trying to do.
And to tell me then, the same type of exploitative persuasion, or like mind control, or whatever you call it, in all of the authoritarian groups and relationships, or they can vary?
It does vary, a lot of it is to do with the strength of how profound the control is. In looking at, and again, the terms that we use are very important. We talk about brainwashing. I don't use the expression because for me that describes the thought reform program, the re-education program brought about by Mao Zedong in 1949.
I use it, but limited. And that's where we get to the heart of the matter. When people are recruited into cults, and we should talk about it, or in abusive relationship and whatever, then of course brainwashing is not used, because brainwashing involves physical detention and physical torture.
Exactly.
But once person is in the cult, it might be used. Again, in Scientology, in Rehabilitation Project Force, then it's a brainwash, classical brainwash, whatever people go through. So
you're absolutely right. The Rehabilitation Project Force is for members of the C organization who are considered to have done something wrong. I can give a specific example. I talked with a woman who had been 20 years in Scientology, and at some point she and her husband were billeted in a room, and to get to the toilet in the middle of the night, they had to go through a room where other people were sleeping, and the people were so packed in that they would inevitably wake them up. And so she and her husband decided that they would urinate in the sink in the room where they were. She spent 4 years in the Rehabilitation Project Force for this crime. It's basically a labor force. You can only speak when spoken to. In many Rehabilitation Project Forces, you're not allowed to have a mattress to sleep on. You run between your jobs. You dress in black so that everybody knows. I never saw this. This was kept from me as a member of Scientology in 9 years. The only time I never saw anybody dressed in black or doing this sort of thing.
Black overalls usually.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it used to be just a black rag around the arm originally. They're basically treated as subhuman. They're called degraded beings. And
they eat only leftovers. They
yeah,
are scrammed at. They are physically abused. They're often doing like menial and very dirty jobs, senseless often.
they'll clean the toilets. If they flash back, which means that they refuse to follow an order, they're given a lap to run. So they're punished. They are not allowed to see their children, though these days they don't have children. The conditions are absolutely awful. The worst case that I know of was a woman who was a long-term Scientologist. She was a child when her parents took her into Scientology, into the Sea organization. And she ended up on a rehabilitation project force in England, in this country, and she fell pregnant. And she told me she was screamed at for 2 weeks to have an abortion, and she refused. And I'm very glad that she did, because she had a lovely daughter who's a wonderful person. But she was then assigned with another pregnant woman to shovel human excrement out of a cesspit into a wheelbarrow and move it to another cesspit, which of course is, just incredibly inhumane. So yes, I would also say that Ron Hubbard came up with the Rehabilitation Project Force in about 1972-73, at a point where he was recovering from a motorcycle accident and had run away to New York, to Queens, New York, so that Scientologists wouldn't see that their great superhuman Ron Hubbard could have a motorcycle accident and mess himself up. While he was there, I believe he read Robert J. Lifton's Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which describes the Chinese brainwashing program. So I would agree with you thoroughly that that is an application of brainwashing. I don't use the word more generally in the same way you don't. Then we have mind control, which describes the experiments performed by US, Canadian, and British intelligence agencies, because they believed that the Russians had worked out how to psychologically control people because of the Stalinist purges and the purge trials that went on, where people confessed to astonishing things. These experiments involved thousands of people. They were horrific. My friend,
experiments in US and Canada and in United Kingdom.
Yes, I mean, particularly in Canada, the man who would, Ewan Cameron, who would become the president of the World Federation of Mental Health, ran these experiments where he would try and wipe somebody's memory by putting them in sensory deprivation tank and then giving them electroconvulsive therapy. And I've seen interviews with people that this was done to, and their memories were completely wiped. They have no recollection of anything before this work. They then tried to implant new ideas into them, and there's a novel called The Manchurian Candidate. There are 2 very good films made from it, which is a fiction, because the program failed. They were not able to do this. And a lot of people who are cult apologists, they support the cult groups, make this ridiculous argument that we believe that cults are turning people into programmed zombies who will do anything they're ordered to do, which has certainly never been my belief. I was never a zombie, and I haven't met any zombies, but I have met people who've done things that they deeply regret for the rest of their lives because of the pressure they were put under. So that's, mind control for me is in that area where you are using quite severe techniques as well. I much prefer the term exploitative persuasion, which was coined by the psychologist Margaret Singer. And I think she and I are the only people who use it. The first time I checked the internet in the 1990s, there were 12 users. 6 were her, 6 were me. The last time I checked a couple of years ago, there were just over 200, and the top 4 were me again. But I think it's a very good expression because it it's self-explanatory, exploitative persuasion. You know, it's a way of doing that. We also have coercive control. In the United Kingdom, we have a law since 2015, which only applies to intimate relationships, but you can take, you can report your partner for seeking to control you, not battering you physically, but controlling your behavior, stopping you from going out and seeing your friends and that sort of thing. And there have been cases. We would like to see that extended so that cult groups can be targeted with it too. Then you have undue influence. Undue influence is the oldest of these terms. It goes back at least 500 years. But this is really just when some old person has left all their money in their will to somebody who has exploited them. And there's a famous case where Lord Francis Bacon in 1610 or something like that, this woman called Mrs. Death, which is quite a name, she'd actually got this old man to come and live in her house. He was in his 80s. Her husband died along the way. She married this guy. She used to whip him. She used to leave him lying in his own excrement in the bed. And basically, she then inherited all the money. And Lord Bacon ruled that this was a case of undue influence, having excessive or too much influence over somebody. So it is recognized in law that this can happen, but not by those sociologists who are paid by groups like Scientology to say that they're perfectly legitimate religions and we're persecuting them by criticizing their behavior in some way.
Well, so all those things about the same time of exploitative persuasion in all groups, and what's the difference between the groups? So I come back to my question.
There are different extremes to which groups will go, and there are parts of persuasion. So I've dealt with a lot of people who were members of the Watchtower Society, with which you have terrible problems in Russia, I know.
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Commonly called the Jehovah's Witnesses. There are probably about 7 million people involved in this group, and in dealing with them, what happens?
You mean in the world?
Yes, in the world. I think when I had the great pleasure of being in St. Petersburg, that there were 80 Kingdom Halls in the St. Petersburg area. So it's quite a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a very controlling form of belief. It allows physical violence to children, which I'm opposed to. I don't think we should be allowed to physically hurt anyone, whether they're an adult, a child, or what have you. It's an assault. It's a wrong thing. They will, if a child makes a noise during one of their meetings, they'll take them into a back room and they'll be flogged so that the congregation can hear their cries of pain. So that's something that doesn't happen in Scientology. So you'll get those kind of differences. I mean, there's a group called the 12 Tribes in the United States where the physical beatings can be very bad. But usually there are certain aspects of control which are down to the malevolence of the leader. So leaders will one of the things I've found is that the leaders are very often alcoholics or drug addicts. I mean, Hubbard showed signs of alcoholism at autopsy, and was
and he was a chain smoker. He smoked like at least 4 packs a day.
Yeah, about 5 packs, about 100 cigarettes a day, unfiltered, the strongest tobacco he could get, which was a brand called Picoon, made in New Orleans, but he used to smoke Cools unfiltered before that. He drank very heavily. He admitted in a lecture to having been addicted to barbiturates. He recommended the use of amphetamines in his early books and lectures. There's still a reference in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Health, about benzodrine, which is an amphetamine, which is to wake people up so they can receive auditing. If we look at the man who called himself Bhagwan, or Supreme God, Sri Rajneesh, he
Osho, also known as Osho.
Osho the Buddha, yeah. That his bodyguard Hugh Milne wrote a biography and said that he took very large doses of diazepam or Valium. He was talking about 50 milligrams a day. The normal dose would be 2 to 5 milligrams. And he spent 2 hours a day sniffing nitrous oxide. And then he'd go out to his followers kind of like this.
Yeah,
and
nitrous oxide, meaning the laughing gas.
Laughing gas, yes. Which, and I mean, that in itself, it had its own cults in the 19th century. Curiously, Hubbard's revelations were first triggered by a dental operation in February 1938, where he had laughing gas, nitrous oxide. I had it for a tooth extraction when I was 8 years old, and it was horrible. It was awful. I don't know why anybody would want to take it, but there you go. I was only 8 years old. But it seems often the case that these are very sick people who are pretending to their followers. So, with Rajneesh, he took a vow of silence, he said, though he would instruct Maranand Sheila and the people who did the work for him, and he'd talk to them. But in public, I think he was so out of his mind that he couldn't talk. And so it was convenient to say, he'd taken a vow of silence. The tricks.
Maybe you should tell about Rajneesh, because it's quite characteristic. He founded a small town in Oregon in the United States, and eventually they committed a terroristic act because they decided to poison all the people in the county so they wouldn't go into elections, so they could elect their own candidates.
And they brought in busloads of homeless people to vote for them.
It didn't work out.
It's the town of Antelope in Oregon.
Yeah.
And they founded the Big Muddy, where they had as many as 10,000 people with no planning permission to do this. There's a documentary called Wild Wild Country where the leaders of the movement talk, but you don't hear anything about the slaves in the movement, the people who worked 19-hour days. But nonetheless, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and what they did eventually, they had a salmonella bacteria, and they spread it around restaurants in the area.
They put it through the salad bars. It's outside of the smallpox poisoning of the Native Americans. It's the largest poisoning in American history.
Fortunately, they weren't expert with it, so none of people died.
Yeah.
But there were up to a little less than 1,000 people with severe poisoning symptoms who were taken into the hospital and everything. So that predated Aum Shinrikyo with the sarin gas and in Tokyo Metro.
Yeah.
But basically the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, Aum Shinrikyo had enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people. That's how much they'd stockpiled. So the groups are very variable, but their approaches, the way that they seduce people into membership, that they prey upon people at points of transition. There's this sort of common idea of cult members as weak-minded people who are, easily led. My friend, Professor Kapta Akhmedova, who studied the Black Widows, suicide bombers in Chechnya, she told me when we first were in touch that she used to use my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, to give to people to explain how it was that somebody who seemed to be relatively intelligent could be taken into a group, because the first 4 chapters of my book are about my own involvement with Scientology. And I'm not sure that was really a compliment, but nonetheless, it got people to read my book, so I suppose it's good. But she understood, as I understand, and as you do, that to radicalize somebody into a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or one of the many other Islamist groups, that you are using the same process. Al-Qaeda, actually, I have some extracts from their recruiting manual, which I was quite surprised by when I first saw it, because it was so much like the recruiting techniques used by the Moonies and Scientology, that you basically will get somebody to, I'm just going to have to search this here. You'll get somebody to yeah, Course in the Art of Recruiting, the document is called. And they say, if you're approaching somebody and trying to recruit them, to radicalize them, don't criticize the candidate's behavior. Thank him for any help, even if it's just a little. Don't disregard his opinion or his manner of thinking. Let him express his opinion, even if it opposes yours. Be close to him in order to get to know more about his character. So we have this pretend friendship where you're bringing somebody in, you know, in looking at the way that Hamas in Israel recruit. They will actually take a young man over the age of 17. They say they won't recruit anybody under the age of 17. And within 3 days, that young man will blow himself up. That's how fast the recruiting process is.
Yeah, that's which brings me to like two things I want to say. Well, what you said, it's interesting because it reminded me a Mormon manual which I read, manual for Mormon missionaries, because their main thing is do not contradict.
Yeah.
When you chat to people, don't say you disagree with him or with her. Just tell it's fine, it's wonderful. It's like, for example, like the matter of baptism. Mormons believe that baptism could be performed only at the adult age. It's reasonable age. And they have like training, and for example, they enter into an apartment, they say, and you say, what do you think about baptism? And the person says, well, in my church, we baptize infants. And Mormons should say, they have several versions of answer, but the right one is to say, well, how wonderful it is that you think that baptism is so important, and that's even like young children could be like performed the baptism, etc., etc. So though they absolutely, that's out of question for Mormons. They have to be like at least 12 to be baptized. They have to be reasonable, but never that they are not allowed to say that they disagree. So.
And the same with Scientology's dissemination manual, that you find agreement. You're only agreeable. You never disagree with somebody as you bring them in.
And the second thing, since you mentioned this Islamistic groups recruitment, one thing what they do in Russia is this. They use romantic relationship very often. And it could be that a girl meets a young man who is very nice to her, who cares about her, and they even get married. And they live in happiness for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then the husband disappears. And she is all at loss. She doesn't know what to do. And then in a couple of days, the friends of her husband come and say, well, you know, your husband was killed by kafirs, by the infidels. And he is there in paradise. And he's waiting for you. And he really misses you. And all you need to do is to pay those awful murderers, pay them back.
Yes.
Those people that killed your husband, go there and push the button, and then you'll join your husband immediately.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this husband probably is in another city seducing another girl.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing returning women from ISIS and I think from Syria. And I think it's terrible that you know, governments, including my own, are just revoking their citizenship. I was at a radicalization awareness network meeting in Lisbon, and I met a wonderful Afghani woman she'd grown up in Denmark, and then she'd been recruited by a young man. And her father, finding out about this, said, okay, you need to understand reality. I'm going to send you back to Afghanistan for 6 months, and you tell me what's really going on in the world. And she, by the time I met her, was working, helping people who were returning from Syria. And that the Danish attitude towards them is not, well, it's their problem. It's our problem. We've got to help these people come back and understand what was done to them. And the majority of them will now fit into society and will become useful in preventing the radicalization of others. So this, I don't agree with the approach that we have in the UK.
To that, well, I have a couple of things. One thing which we mentioned, but then we drifted away from it. What I wanted to note when I talk to different audiences, I always tell them that do not think that it can never happen to me. This is the wrong thing, because anybody can get into a cult or cultic relationship, and there are two prerequisites for that. One is that a person gets a right offer. So we all have like different things we can be caught by. It's like a fish, one fish is caught by
different bait,
different or whatever. So and each of us has sort of a weak point, and each of us has our points of interest and everything. Each one can be caught on a bait. It's just that often we never kind of encounter this bait, fortunately. But when we were offered it, and when we are offered it in an opportunate moment, in the right moment, and right moment is when we are the most vulnerable. And we're most vulnerable usually when we live through stress. And then when those two things come together, then it's our bad luck.
I think the
probability that we get into cult is very high at this point.
Yeah, and the stress is interesting, because the stress is often simply a transition or a dislocation. So when you move away to another place and you're making new friends, when you take on a new job, when you enter a new relationship, when you lose a relationship, the LaRouche's followers of Lyndon LaRouche in the US, they will look down the lists of obituaries to find people who've been widowed, and then they will go and approach them. But it's not necessarily even a negatively stressful point. It's just a point of transition that will make people vulnerable.
And also age transition, because as far as I'm concerned, there are two age groups which are the most vulnerable.
Teenagers and people at the end of in their 60s and above.
It's teenagers, and then people who are about to retire or who retire.
Absolutely.
And then person retires, and suddenly he has lots of free time and he doesn't know what to do with it. All his rhythm of life is broken, and usually people live through it, and then they find what to do and everything, but they need several months or several years to new adjustment. And then there are predators that are looking for exactly for these people, for young people, and then this people in this whatever retirement age.
And I think with teenagers, my very good friend Yuval Laor has worked a lot on the emotional aspect of this, and points out that teenagers are emotionally a lot more vulnerable, because in your teens you start being able to be infatuated with things, to be really profoundly emotionally attached to things. So you're more vulnerable. I think there's a very important point, having worked with this for all of these years, that we all know that advertising doesn't work on us, But we all know that advertising does work on other people. Now, there's a little bit of a problem there. And it's taken me a long time to try and get to that in simple terms. Why is it that we all know that we're not vulnerable, but we know that other people are? And I think it's this simple. If I didn't believe that my perception and my interpretation of the world was good, then I would find it impossible to live. I have to believe in my own perception and interpretation. If somebody shows me that it's wrong, then that will cause cognitive dissonance. I will start to feel confused. And what will happen, and cognitive dissonance is the most tested theory in all of psychology. What will happen is I will believe more firmly in my own invulnerability if it's challenged. I will, if you show me evidence that I'm wrong, it will make me more convinced that I'm right. How to get people past that? How to get people to realize, exactly as you say, of course we're all vulnerable. We're all human. And if somebody, as you say, comes along with the right offer, I mean, you think about the Children of God. There's a very fine documentary called The Children of God, where a woman who had, I think, 7 children.
Children of God is an American and international cult, which was doing horrible things. It was like pedophile, institutionally pedophile. They were doing all incest, and actually it was their rule. Actually, they all had to participate in the incest, and then many of the women were turned into prostitutes, and they were recruiting people through like prostitution. It was called flirty fishing and everything. And it's just amazing how people can be coerced into like having sex with their own children. How they could be, and it's awful. But I'm just explaining about this cult.
And the aspect of it, you're absolutely right. The children from the age of about 3 were expected to watch adults having sex and to imitate them. And they then would be brought up to be part of this thing. It's the aspect of flirty fishing, this idea of the right offer, that, some man is approached by a beautiful young woman who then wants to have sex with him and doesn't want to charge him any money for it. I mean, for many of us who are not the most handsome creatures in the world, to be approached by a beautiful young woman is of itself the right offer. Now, fortunately, that's not, beautiful young women haven't approached me, and I happen to be in a fantastic relationship, so I wouldn't be interested anyway. But you can see that if somebody's lonely or that they have a low opinion of themselves, that will be the right offer. And also, it's their vulnerability. So if people offer us something, you can become rich by joining our multi-level marketing organization, Amway, or, whatever. You can become, women will throw themselves at your feet if you do our pickup artist course. There's a great film called Magnolia. And curiously, the star of it is Tom Cruise, who's a Scientologist. But he acts as a pickup artist. He trains people. And one of the lines in it, which I always remember, is he says, how to fake like you are nice and caring, which is, very bad English indeed. But this idea of luring people with this false front, this superfice.
Yeah, and John, I sent you this video with this poor 16-year-old boy from Tatarstan who is recording this video as he was going to what he believes to be a terrorist act. He actually never succeeded. He tried to burn the police office, but his Molotov cocktail didn't explode. And then he attacked policemen with a knife and was shot.
Yeah.
So, what do you think of this video? I told you shortly, of course, it's in Russian, but I told you shortly what the boy was saying and what could be done to prevent it.
I mean, let me first say it's one of many such videos I've seen over the years, because as I say, I became interested in terrorism in the 1990s, seeing that the dynamics were the same. I think in this case, the boy's stepfather had radicalized him. Is that right?
Well, there are two things. It's his stepfather. The boy was Russian, but the stepfather was of ethnical Muslim background. And then they say he also, but his guru, his teacher, was abroad, and he was instructing him via internet.
Yeah, which is often the case these days. Firstly, let me make a really firm statement that this is not the fault of Islam, which is being, sadly, Muslims are being persecuted throughout the world as terrorists. In China, of course, in Xinjiang, they've tried to put the whole population through a re-education camps. At least 1 million people have gone through these camps. In the United States, if you happen to be an Arab, then you're quite likely to be attacked, even though 70% of the Arabs in the United States are actually Christians. There are specific cults within Islam. So within the Sunniya, the Sunni Muslims, we have Wahhabis or Salafis, a movement that was started in Saudi Arabia. And within that movement came the militant Salafis. Their view is that they wish to retake Dar al-Islam. They want to take back all of the lands that were once ruled by Islam. Then you have ISIS, who want to reinstate the caliphate, which is pretty much the same idea. And they became radicalized. Saudi Arabians who went to Afghanistan to fight against the Russian occupation, the communist government, so-called communist government in Afghanistan, they didn't go there as members of Al-Qaeda. Even Osama bin Laden was actually part of a faction that said we must cause change through democracy initially, but then he was recruited by somebody who said the only thing we can do is to fight a war, and so a war was declared. So the first thing is to say that the Salafis make up less than 0.5% of Muslims. There are also some Shiite sects that have created terrorism, but the first thing is to say that this is a very small percentage of Muslims, because we really have to be careful that we're looking at the people who are dangerous. Within that, I started a few years ago talking about what I call pre-radicalization. And that is to prepare somebody for exactly the approach that they will get from somebody who's trying to radicalize them. That, somebody will be charming to them, they'll flatter them, they'll agree with them, they'll bring them along. If you're in a society where there is unfairness, and I would say that Israel is sadly an example of unfairness, where you have a divided or apartheid situation where Jewish Israelis are considered superior to Arab Israelis. And I have personal experience of this. I have met and talked with people, and many of my friends are Israelis or Jews, and that's good. But we have this division. So if you are brought up as a Palestinian or as an Israeli Arab, in a situation where at the age of 2, you'll be taken to a photographer and a little suicide belt will be put on you and you'll pose, and there are billboards calling these people Shaheed or martyrs, that it is quite easy to recruit somebody into this idea, especially in their teens, when they're easily infatuated. Their life is very difficult because they can't get work in this country. They're checked and searched wherever they go. So, you have a situation where it's very easy to recruit people. So the first thing I would say is that we need tolerance. We need to talk to each other, listen to other people's ideas.
But we're talking about a boy in a small town in Tatarstan.
Yeah.
And then the boy is Russian, but then in Tatarstan, like 55% of population is Muslim, at least, ethnically Muslim. So there is no like persecution of Muslims whatsoever. So it's normal.
But the way that the persecution, I'm just saying that that's a first sort of level. The way that persecution becomes relevant is that there are places in the world where Muslims are being persecuted, And that of itself is something that we should all be concerned about. So my first level of introduction is to say that our education systems should include material about the great benefits that came out of Islamic society through the Crusades. You're an expert on this area, but that we have the word algebra, for example, from the Arabic, because this was something that was worked out. Optical surgery, quarantine, all sorts of benefits. If there was some education that brought together populations and said benefits have occurred that have come from the translation movement in Islam, and if we then looked at what has happened since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, and the way that countries like Lebanon, Palestine, Syria were created and rules were enforced on them. So, for example, in Lebanon, the French denied the vote to anybody who was not Christian. They put tyrants in charge. The democracy of Iran was overthrown. I think these are things that need to be known because they create less pressure in the society. From there, you go to actually showing people what the techniques, what a predator looks like, how to recognize somebody who's predatory, and to be very suspicious of anybody who suddenly pretends to be your best friend, who suddenly is completely agreeing with you and flattering you and telling you what to do. I think that those stages, understanding the seduction, the recruitment process, and the predators and the agents of the predators, because the person who will recruit you will usually be an agent, not actually directly a predator, but they will use predatory tactics. They will basically, another aspect of this which we haven't mentioned, which is used in Scientology and other groups, is to, excuse me, to find the ruin, to find out what is, this person thinks they can't get over, I'll never get a job, my girlfriend's left me. That find the ruin and home in on that and say, well, there is no solution to that. And the solution will then be offered by the cult, whether it's Scientology saying you need to buy a lot of Scientology, or it's a radicalizer saying, well, you can go to paradise if you blow yourself up. So I think, and teaching intelligent disobedience, teaching as many people as we can to think for themselves, and teaching how we are emotionally susceptible, that when people give us an experience of a peak experience, and there are many techniques, as used within cult groups, meditational techniques, for example, the mindfulness movement to spread around the world. There is no scientific evidence supporting it, despite all the claims. Mark Williams, who's a professor at Oxford, who teaches a master's degree in mindfulness, is on record as saying, as yet, the evidence doesn't exist to support these benefits. Yet, it's followed transcendental meditation. And the thing is, if you don't know that sitting still and staring at something will cause you to have what's called the Ganzfeld effect, that you will feel euphoric, you'll feel better. If you don't know these things, then you'll think that the group or the person is giving you a gift, something special. But in fact, any repetitive or fixed perception or mimicry, these are all ways that will bring about, through 100 or 1,000 different techniques, they'll bring about the same thing, which is that you'll feel euphoric, you'll get high. And that's a very important part of the recruitment process, some way of making you feel better, making you feel happier. But, as any cocaine addict can explain, feeling high is not actually a way to having a better life. In fact, our judgment is impaired when we feel euphoric, when we feel high, just as it's impaired when we feel sad. We look through the world through rose-tinted glasses or through grey-tinted glasses according to our mood. And we need to be careful that we don't make our decisions, important decisions, when we're in either of those moods.
Well, so I think our time is up.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So we'll break now, and then there'll be questions.
Yeah.
Of our listeners, of our participants of our seminar. So let's now shut up.
A short period of time.
Yeah, and allow them to ask their questions.
Great. And I'll sign off. I'm John Atack. This is my dear friend, and we've known each other, since about 1993 or something, a long time.
Yeah.
Professor Alexander Dvorkin, and
from Moscow.
From Moscow. And I'm in Nottingham in England.
Yeah. Now, and the seminar is in Kazan.
Great.
Tatarstan.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.